I'm going to tell you two themes in introducing our final afternoon speaker, Governor Hickenlooper. One of them involves brewing. Who here enjoys beer? Who enjoys craft beer? I'm not going to ask those who don't because I don't care. I still am going to ask you to listen. It's easy to think of the craft brew movement as some kind of fringe development in the United States, but it's been a genuinely important development over the past generation, and it's a restoration of something that had been valuable in America's history. As historians of the beer industry will know, back in the 1800s, before refrigeration, essentially every town in the U.S. had its own brewery because beer couldn't travel. It was perishable, it was part of local culture, and there were thousands of breweries across the United States. After Prohibition, the mistaken path the United States went on early in the 20th century, the number of breweries shrank and there was consolidation in the industry, and there was a time in the 1960s, early 1970s, when the number of breweries in the U.S. had shrunk to about 100. And they were the big industrial breweries we know so well from that era. Then a savior appeared in the form of Governor Hickenlooper. No, he has many virtues, but it's not this one. In the form of, whoever it might be, the savior was President Jimmy Carter, my one-time employer. And he decided, not because his brother Billy had his own Billy beer brand of brewing, but as part of Jimmy Carter's deregulation agenda. He deregulated the airlines to mixed effect, as we all know. He deregulated trucking to greater efficiency, and he deregulated home brewing. And anybody who's been involved in the craft brew movement will tell you that is when things changed, when Carter did that in the late 1970s. Recently, the number of breweries in the United States crossed the 5,000 mark, and they've become an important part of local identity, local commerce, local pride. They've been an important part of urban redevelopment too, because breweries often go where the land is inexpensive and they attract people there of a generally well-behaved, although not always a manner in night times. And so they become an important economic and civic tool of American development. So I mention this because Governor Hickenlooper, before he was a governor, before he was a mayor of Denver, was a restaurateur and brewer. And so he, as I pointed out earlier, he's the first brewer to become a U.S. governor since Sam Adams, namesake of the Boston Brew Company. So that's one important thing to know about our next speaker, Governor Hickenlooper, that he is part of the movement that has saved America with the craft brew movement. The other is, I think you can think of him as part of another movement that can save America. The argument that Deb and I make in the book that's been on your table, in the book Our Towns, is that for the foreseeable future, the national level of politics in the United States, and a number of other democracies too, seems to be a zero-sum contest station. In order for me to win, you have to lose. I'm going to block your bills, I'm going to filibuster your nominees, I'm going to do everything I can to poison your interests at the national level. It's a tribute to the dynamism that the United States and some other democracies have, that as a country we've been able so far to withstand this national level paralysis and standoff, but it is not a good thing for this country or for a number of other Western democracies. And what we argue in our book is that at the local and state and regional level across the country, there's a very different spirit of people emphasizing practical compromise and positive achievement and long-term plans and, as they say, win-win solutions of being able to do things that will help a city, a state, a region develop in the long run. And I contend that the next wave of leadership in the United States will be somebody from that tradition, not somebody who has made his or her reputation thwarting the other side, but somebody who's made his or her reputation bringing people together, being able to do things that build popularity and prosperity and comity and inclusion and all the other things we would like to think Western democracy in the United States are for. There are lots of people, we don't know where this next wave of leadership will come from, but again, there are many, many examples across the country of whom Governor Hickenlooper, now ending his successful second term as governor of Colorado, is an illustration. And so I think he may tell us partly about how GIS and geospatial thinking has informed his time in Colorado, but also how to think about this next stage of leadership, of inclusive leadership rather than divisive, polarizing, zero-sum leadership. So there's the two contexts, the miracle of craft brewing and the miracle of local leadership that I think are important in introducing Governor Hickenlooper. He is trained as a geologist originally. I believe he's the first geologist to be a state governor, and if I'm wrong, I'm sure we'll hear that in a moment. But he's been very successful in his town, first in Denver, then his state of Colorado, in trying to bring people together and have an environmentally sustainable, culturally diverse and inclusive and economically prosperous regime for his state. So with that, I ask you please to join me in welcoming Governor John Hickenlooper.
Thank you. Too nice, way too nice. I did want to just add a little more context to the value of beer in colonial times and historic times, because in many cases it was the only place you could get fresh water. The water was unsanitary, therefore, and they'd make the beer very weak so that it was a reliable source of drinkable liquids. And Thomas Jefferson once wrote a letter, much quoted in the craft beer industry, saying, "I wish to see this beverage become more common." And luckily it did. Before I even begin, I just want to give a plug, and this is not because of the nice compliments that James Fallow just paid me, but James Fallow's book that you have, Our Towns, on your desk, is one of the best books in terms of it comes out at a time when many people are frustrated and feel a rising level of despair. And this book is filled with the richness of what's going on in America on those smaller towns and smaller cities, and the ways people are adjusting and reacting to some of the pressures of automation and outsourcing and the challenges of what we hear all the time. And it really is inspiring. And in a funny way, I had ended up in a bunch of those, several of the cities he looked at, I opened brew pubs in. So I don't know how that happened. It's a coincidence, but I don't think I've seen another book in 5 or 10 years that is more upbeat in terms of its analysis of where we are, and then kind of laying out, here's a spirit. Here's not just one or two places where things are coming out differently, but these are really important places. So don't put that book, into the bookcase until it's been well thumbed. All right. I also want to give a shout out to, and I know that Jack Dangermond is not here, but what he and his team of Esri has done for those of us that are map geeks. And again, I am the only geologist, only practicing geologist. I have a master's and had a career in geology. I'm the only practicing geologist to ever become a practicing governor in the history of the United States. And there's probably good reasons for that I would avoid. But I will tell you that I grew up with from the earliest memory, I would make little pirate maps of our yard and where I would bury certain treasure. It was done in paces. And my feet, unfortunately, didn't stay the same small size that they were back then, so that my maps would become outdated very quickly. Today, we look at the anxiety that people have. They're worried about their lives and their future jobs. People are worried about technology and what it means to their children and their children's jobs. In a funny way, a lot of that anxiety comes from the fact that we are in this golden age of data. But what we often don't see is that this golden age of data is also the golden age of maps. And the ability to take maps and actually create things of real value and meaning is immense. And it is, I think, in many ways provides solutions and really optimistic forecasts for a lot of what ails the country. And I think that historically maps used to be, if you go back centuries, millennia, Maps were made of what is, what the landscape looks like, where those animal paths went. And slowly, as we learned how to build things, and roads and bridges eventually, we would begin to we'd add on to maps things that we had created ourselves. Still was the past, but began that process of putting onto maps what we hope to build, the future. And that kind of ushered in that era, certainly in the last couple hundred years, of design, where maps became a tool by which we enhanced our ability to design our future. What's happened in the relatively recent history, and by this I mean going back 30 years or 40 years, but really in the last 10 or 15 years, where we've been able to integrate that sense of mapness of what was, and integrate that into our design of the future, and then take imaging and real-time information to make maps, that integration between the past and the future, and we're really seeing maps of the present. And I think that's something that too often people don't recognize, that this is a moment that is going to have unbelievable transformational capacity for not just for elected leaders, but for businesses, for nonprofits. I saw the presentation on the Red Cross. I think that's a classic example of some of this stuff is just going to get better. Maps also, and too often this is overlooked, are a powerful tool by which people work together and collaborate. Another natural resource that we seem to have in short supply. Maps allow us to create shared goals and then use data accurately to get there. I think in all these cases, we're allowing technology to ultimately be our salvation. And of course, you've got to make sure that, like any technology, it's only as good as the information that goes into it. Maps are even more prone to this. When I first became governor, we had a map of all the roads in the state of Colorado. We were telling people that we had, I think it was $12 or $14 billion of unmet need in the condition of our roads. And so as I drove around the state in my first year, I got out and checked the condition of the road surface to see whether we were really in as bad shape as it was. And our map had color-coded every state highway, and purple was the worst condition. Well, I got out on a lot of these country roads, and they were in fine condition. And when I asked the map makers at the Department of Transportation, they said, well, any road that hasn't been resurfaced in at least 20 years, we assume that's in decline, in terrible condition. Well, literally, in the course of a year, we reduced the amount of money that we thought we'd have to spend on improving roads by almost 50%. Because it depends obviously on the condition is not just the age, but it's the use and the maintenance and the weather conditions in that road, in that place, and how big the trucks or vehicles are that are using that road. I think that in that sense, that's a simple example, but in that sense, it's really a question of how we make sure that we have good data at all times. Now, I want to show, when you talk about the past, I have a map here, which is one of my favorite maps a friend gave me. And that's a map from the 19th century of North America. And you'll notice on the left that the Rocky Mountains go all the way from the northern coast of Alaska in a straight, unbroken line, all the way down through, down to the end of Central America. A rudimentary map based on erroneous data. Certainly doesn't look anything like an Esri map. But I do think it's remarkably beautiful. I wanted to also put up another example of a map. Now that's me 30 years ago. And that you can see hanging down over the side of what is, you can't really recognize, but that's about to become the bar top of our first brew pub. And I decided I wanted the bar top to be a map or a representation of a map. And so I took all the geographical symbols and we basically poured a 3-inch thick concrete bar top. And you can see those are on the left, those little dotted lines, that's copper. We took 1.5-inch pieces of copper, put it on top of the plywood, and then poured the concrete to the top, grinded it off, but those dotted lines that you see in copper, that's shale, just in case your geology is a little bit rusty. And I think that is a real, we're trying to get a slip fault on that one on the right. We didn't quite get that perfectly. But that was a representation in our first restaurant of what maps looked like. We got more comments on that because people thought it was a real place. And they kept saying, well, where is this from? And I told them that, I had a friend who imagined the entire thing. If you look at what maps are going to be useful for going forward, in real time, population shifts. We're about to do a census in a couple of years, and population shifts, we are so much more ready to map population shifts and continue the changes in census tracts more rapidly than we ever have been. Transportation, highways, conditions, I've mentioned already. Drought conditions, certainly in the western United States. It's hard to imagine something more serious than our water needs and the changing precipitation, how much falls as snow, all that stuff. And yet with up-to-date mapping and good data, we are way out ahead of that. So despite the fact that we're getting much less precipitation than we need, I think we're actually increasing in our capacity to maintain a high quality of life with less water. 2012 and 2013, droughts led to some of the worst wildfires we had in the history of Colorado. And those fires really did challenge us. And even between then and now, in terms of how we fight fires, it is remarkable. These fires forced thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. At one point in 2012, we had over 32,000 people evacuated out of their homes in southern Colorado, mostly around Colorado Springs. Esri was able to help us use continuously updating information, making sure that we took the official maps and posted them. And this isn't the best, and I take the blame for this, but this is a map of a fire that we're dealing with right now, the Spring Creek Fire, down near Alamosa, Colorado. But we have maps now that every day as the map grows, each extension of the fire line is in a different color. And so not only can you see where the map is, but you can see the rate of change. We can overlay that with wind direction. So we have a prediction of what the weather, the meteorologist tells us, and then as the day progresses, maybe those winds change in a different way than we anticipated, then we are able to really go forward and say, all right, we have to readjust our priorities and where we put our hotshot crew, where we get our tanker to drop water and retardant, is allowing us in ways that literally 5 years ago we couldn't have imagined, and I think dramatically not only helps us fight fires better, but keeps the firefighters safer, make sure that we are able to integrate all different matters of changes. What we're seeing there is that same fire, as the fire lines change, we have to put more intense resources in the places where we have the greatest risk. Simultaneously, we're able to allow citizens in real time to see how much, where their home, their building is at risk, and how much they should worry. I think having that technology also allows us to, you're never going to have enough resources for everything you want to do, but it allows us to make best use of all the resources we do have. We also see often wildfires lead to flash floods and terrible floods. In 2013, we had, you can see in this picture, not only is the roadbed washed away by the flood, but the entire subroad. And we had stretches that went on for miles about that from that September 2013 flood. We displaced over 18,000 people because of those floods. And originally we were going to try, our Department of Transportation said, well, we can't possibly happen on, the flood started on September 11th, really reached their apex September 14th. They didn't think we could get people back into their houses by the middle of January. Well, by that time it's snowing. Almost certainly you get more delays. we were able to use the mapping and redesigning the contours of the highway to get maximum resilience so they wouldn't get washed away again the next time, but also to get those designs and into the different crews working together and integrating, again, through maps, people taking away gravel and debris, people putting in roadbed. We were able to get everyone back into their house before Thanksgiving. And again, without mapping and without Esri, that certainly wouldn't have happened. And I think getting those decisions right in real time, this notion of really real time is hugely important. We looked at, again, here is a representation of just how large that flood event was. But we also were able to take the GIS risk data and look at how frequently you see a flood of that size to make sure that we're just not rebuilding it in the same way and that we're able to build things better. When people have lost everything their home, their lifetime of photographs, whatever, you can't come and say, well, we're going to build it back. You've got to come back and say, you're going to build it better. And having that data was a big part of that. I think after the flood, Esri worked at no expense to taxpayers to make sure that we were able to communicate to the citizens what the risks were and what were the opportunities, right, to mitigate against those risks and make sure that we didn't suffer from future disasters in the same way. Esri has these, and I'm sure most of you have seen, the story maps and how you're able to take valuable information, put it into the context of a map, and really tell a story, which again, didn't exist 10 years ago, and is something that it enhances our ability to talk to the public at a level that I don't think anyone could imagine even 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that level of resilience, rebuilding things back to the way, not just to the way they were, but stronger, is something that is, I think it's every citizen's right that they should expect that. Certainly, one other thing we have to do is when we are changing rapidly. In Colorado, when I got laid off back in 1986, so I came out as a geologist. I thought I was a pretty good geologist. Evidently, I wasn't quite as good as I thought, because when our company got sold and everyone got laid off, and pretty much every other company was getting rid of geologists, there seemed to be no suitors for my talent, which is to say I couldn't even get a job interview, how I ended up in the brew pub business. That recession lasted for almost 11 years in Colorado, so we worked very hard to diversify our economy, and a lot of what we've done in terms of selling Colorado is our natural beauty, 300 days of sunshine, more live music venues in Denver than there are in Nashville or Austin. I could do you a whole sales pitch. 26 ski resorts by most magazines or measures for the top 10 ski resorts in the world. But all this comes back down to a love of place. And that's been a big part of what we use to sell to get to diversify our economy and to inspire more entrepreneurs and small businesses to move into Colorado from other places. And again, making sure that you have the ability to, I call it, there's a word for it called topophilia, which is love of place, has been a big part of our sales pitch. And if you're attracting people and growing, you better be darn good at really seeing how you're going to accommodate that growth, how are you going to have the infrastructure that you need, where you need it, to provide people everything from mobility, redundant utilities, so you can't lose from one wildfire, you can't lose your access to electricity or communications, making sure that you have broadband in every city and town of any size, which we will have within the next 2.5 or 3 years in Colorado. It also allows you to make sure you maintain clean air and clean water. Our ability to monitor air quality stations in real time and account for the predictions and use those calculations and those maps to address real issues. We were the first state to actually get the environmental community and the oil and gas industry to sit down and figure out what are appropriate regulatory frameworks to reduce fugitive emissions, right? The methane or other natural gases escaping from pipelines or oil and gas activity. And by doing it with the environmental community and the industry in the same room, we were able to control the cost, make sure every dollar actually was spent in making the air cleaner, making sure that we got in real time make sure that there wasn't a bunch of red tape and bureaucracy. And then lastly, in real time, making sure that the industry got credit along with the oil and gas industry. So the final outcome was that the equivalent of about we took 300, the equivalent, we took 300, it's been a long day. Now I'm wandering, and I have not had a single beer. We took the equivalent of 300,000 vehicles a year off of our roads, really just by mapping and really working in that compromise on methane regulations. And I don't think you could have ever done that without maps, without making sure you had that. We've also looked at some of the other social challenges that come from an expanding population. We were one of the first states to really get a serious problem with opioids and the epidemic of opioid addiction and prescription drugs. And we were able to map where we saw the worst outbreaks, what age groups those outbreaks were taking place in, what clinics and what support we had, which middle schools and high schools do we have to do a better job of explaining the risk of, just because you got a cap or a dental implant, you should not take, and no matter what the prescription you were given, you shouldn't take any opioids for more than 3 or 4 days unless absolutely necessary. We worked on all that stuff together through our database and mapping systems, and allowed, through the Colorado Consortium to prevent prescription drug abuse, we now, for the last 2 years, have actually seen a decline in opioid addiction and opioid deaths. Certainly all this stuff is dependent upon making sure you have accurate census information, population data, whether you're talking about drug abuse or air pollution, transportation infrastructure. Knowing what the needs are and where people are is absolutely crucially important. We need to know which counties are growing, how they want to grow, and also to make sure that we have the ability to empower rural communities to attract businesses and entrepreneurs and engage with their current population to make sure that they want to grow and that they're growing in the places and the types of jobs that they want. All this data allows us to become more resilient. You all know the risks that come with more sophisticated maps and more sophisticated data. Cybersecurity is probably the one thing that I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and I'll be in a cold sweat just because it is, as we become more successful in taking this information and making it resilient, the challenge seems always greater. And sometimes, we looked at it and you can get a little depressed. I'll finish with this, that when you're facing the biggest challenge, the steepest hill, sometimes the real solution is just to work a little harder. And when I first ran for mayor of Denver in 2003, it's the first time I ever ran for political office. I never ran for student council or class president. Didn't really like the people that did. I'm not trying to offend anybody in the room. I'm just being blunt. But I was at 4% in the polls, and Denver's a strong mayor city, very competitive race. And we were at 4 or 5% of the polls for the first 6 weeks. I kept thinking, I'm a small business guy. I've opened 17 restaurants. I've been in business 15 years. They're gonna want that common sense in government. Well, maybe not so much. They weren't immediately paying attention. I carried a clipping from the Denver Post in my pocket to kind of inspire all my young volunteers. And this is just in the context of having to work harder when things are tougher. The clipping talked about a professor of public speaking at the University of Wyoming up in Laramie, and talking about the importance of using opposites when you speak publicly. If you talk about the worst of times, talk about the best of times. If you talk about the agony, talk about the ecstasy. And this teacher asked her class, what's the opposite of despair? The kid said, joy. She goes, exactly. If you want people to feel despair, use joy in the same sentence. The words create emotional impact by proximity. Then she said, what's the opposite of woe? And a kid way in the back goes, giddy up. And the bottom line is that in almost every case, and especially I think around the challenges we face with technology and making sure we keep in front of it, the opposite of woe is to giddy up. Thank you very much.